welcome to the I&D podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Before we get started today, like, comment, and subscribe at the end of the video and join our growing international community. Now, our main story today is going to be concerning heads of states in Western countries. Now, the reason that we're doing this report is over the last 2 weeks, I have personally been extensively reporting on Ukraine. Number one, I'm kind of fucking sick of it. Number two, while I have been reporting on Ukraine specifically, I have noticed a common trend among the Western leaders who are engaged in this conflict. And I began to notice that they all have major domestic problems. So I just wanted to cover the domestic policies and what's going on at home for world leaders like Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, the General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, Emmanuel Macron, the leader of France, and Germany's Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. Now, this report is not directly concerning Ukraine, but it does establish one thing. Leaders that have domestic at-home problems tend to seek external issues to distract their people and gain popular support by creating an external enemy. Now, I'm not saying that that is what is happening around the Russo-Ukrainian crisis right now. There are various legitimate concerns for the United States, for the Western world, and for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We are not going to go into detail about those because we have done so extensively over the last 2 weeks. If you have missed out on that, please enter our Europe playlist. Pretty much every video in there, made in the last week or two, is concerning Ukraine and goes over the crisis extensively. But what this video does establish is that leaders that are having domestic issues do tend to seek external conflicts. And whether or not they're legitimate, they tend to get as involved as they can to immerse themselves in this conflict and their people to distract at domestic issues. So let's just cover on some of the domestic problems that many of these world leaders are facing. Now, number one is going to be everyone's favorite scarecrow lookalike, Prime Minister Boris Johnson from the United Kingdom. Now, Boris Johnson has actually had a relatively successful prime ministership, though it has been tumultuous. He's gone from moments where he's been extremely popular to extremely hated to extremely popular to extremely hated. The man is extremely polarizing. But Boris Johnson, generally speaking, is very good with the media, interacting with constituents and gaining popular support. And this is done intentionally. Boris Johnson is charismatic in his own way, adapting a intentionally goofy, disheveled, silly appearance and behavior that makes him the British everyman. And that has helped Boris Johnson gain the everyman, everyday Englanders' approval. Not Englanders, but citizen of the UK's approval. Now, there has been one giant scandal that is threatening to completely destroy Boris Johnson's entire image. Now, the scandal in and of itself is terrible. It's very bad. But what is even worse is how contradicting it is to the everyman, disheveled, goofy appearance that Boris Johnson has portrayed of himself, being almost anti-elitist. Now, I'm talking, of course, about Partygate. Now, basically, Partygate is the result of an investigation into the Conservative Party leadership, or the government of the United Kingdom, the party that is ruling the government of the UK. What this investigation found was, as this government instituted very strict lockdowns that came with heavy fines and serious criminal penalties, while these lockdowns were being introduced in the UK, the Conservative Party government, including the Prime Minister, were having parties and social gatherings, which were outlawed at the time, for themselves in various government buildings. Now, the most egregious being number 10 Downing Street, or as it's commonly called in Britain, number 10, which is the residence of the Prime Minister himself, which is so fucking hypocritical. Telling your people they cannot party, they cannot have social gatherings, they can't see their loved ones, while having extremely elitist British parties is absurd in and of itself. That is a terrible scandal. That is, it applies to thee, but not for me. It is extremely elitist. And that's what's even worse for old Boris himself, who has made a significant effort throughout his entire political career to distance himself from Britain's elite. Now, it should be stated that Boris Johnson is not your average everyday British man. Boris Johnson comes from a family of privilege, a family that has ties to aristocracy, a family that is the high class and elite of the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson was a member of various collegiate organizations that introduced him to other British prime ministers. He is a member of what people call secret societies, etc. Now, they're not as insidious as movies and other shows make it seem, but the reality is Boris Johnson is an elitist, and that there's nothing wrong with that, okay? A lot of people were members of fraternities in their life. I was in America. People join organizations. They like to have drinks and wear suits. That's perfectly fine. But the problem is it completely contradicts Boris's image, which has been, as I've stated, the average British Joe, if you will, or average Boris. And the reality is Boris Johnson privately doesn't actually live life like that. And it does demonstrate to the British people that everything that, the way he acts, the way he talks, the way he dresses, the way his fucking hair looks, is an act to make himself seem more likable and seem more average and everyday. Now, Boris Johnson, out of all of the leaders in terms of the Ukraine crisis, has been the most personally invested, using the most flamboyant, flaming, and aggressive rhetoric out of any Western world leader. He's extremely invested in what's going on, and he's adopted an almost Churchill-like complex of being this man fighting to maintain peace, but being tough on Russia at the same time. Now, there is a clear reason to do this. It is distracting the people of the UK very successfully. And this is not a criticism against Boris Johnson. If I was in his situation, I would do the exact same thing. The reality is Boris is not personally invested in what's going on in Ukraine. He's personally invested in consolidating domestic support. Very similar to the next leader that we're going to cover, which is United States President Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden, very similar to Boris Johnson, despite the fact that both of them have very different personalities and different public images. Joe Biden has fluctuated regarding public support, though in recent months, his public support in the United States has significantly decreased. This is primarily caused by issues such as inflation, a major labor shortage, America's rent crisis, and other economic problems that are facing everyday Americans. Now, the economy isn't terrible in the United States. It's actually quite well. It hasn't been doing that bad for the last 10 years. That's just a reality, okay? But nonetheless, it could be better. And many people are blaming Joe Biden for things like increasing gas prices, general inflation, the price of rent, and the fact that life is a little bit more expensive than it used to be 2 to 3 years ago. Now, the president has very little influence over inflation and other factors like that. I'm not defending Joe Biden, that's just a fact. That is a major problem that Biden is facing. Another issue is that Biden's legislation that he's been trying to push through Congress has many times garnered massive opposition, not just from the other party, being the Republican Party, but from his own party, the Democrats, have opposed much of his legislation, a lot of it being tied to his Build Back Better plan, which is a fundamental and crucial aspect of his campaign promises and what he intends to be his entire campaign legacy. Now, finally, what I'm going to mention now, a lot of people in the media don't want to talk about, even though everyone in the public does talk about it. The reason why is it's considered a health concern, and it's considered too private to delve into, and this can be considered insulting, but it's not. Joe Biden is the leader of the free world. He is the president of the United States. He has a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. And when you have that much responsibility, that affects countless people all over the world, billions of people all over the world. You have to be open to all forms of criticism. Your personal health, your well-being, and the way that your mind is functioning are not matters of private concern. They are matters of public concern. So I'm just going to talk about it. And I'm going to try and be as polite as I can be. Joe Biden is old as shit. He's a goddamn geriatric. That is no fault of Joe Biden's own. But the reality is Joe Biden is 79 years old, and it shows. Now, again, this is not Joe Biden's fault. He did not 79 years and 9 months ago tell his mom, hey, this is a good time to get knocked up. No, Joe Biden is just that age, and it is showing. The reality is that if you look at Joe Biden today at the age of 79 and you look at Joe Biden back when he was a senator, when he was around 40 to 50 years old, there's a significant difference in his mental cognitiveness. And there are a lot of moments, especially when he thinks that he's off camera, where he's visibly lost. Now, I'm not going to go so far and state that he is demented. Probably he isn't, and there's not enough proof for that. But the reality is that the mental efficacy of the President of the United States is something that many people in America who vote, constituents, are thinking about. Now, finally, all of these issues are beginning to compile as America is in the middle of an election year. Not for Joe Biden's office itself. The presidency is not going to be up until 2024. But the reality is in 2022, right now, America is facing midterm elections. And many people are viewing these elections as a mandate, not a mandate, as an election on Joseph Biden's term as president so far. And the reality is these midterm elections could have major consequences that could make passing legislation even more difficult for Biden if he loses control of both houses of Congress. Now, another aspect that needs to be understood is that the President of the United States is the leader of the free world, the world in general. The reality is that the United States is still, while not as powerful as it was 20, 30 years ago, as other countries have arisen, like specifically China, that challenged the United States' hegemonic stage on the world. Now, the United States, despite other rivals arising like China, is still the world's most powerful country, militarily speaking, economically speaking, financially speaking, politically speaking, diplomatically speaking, and it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. Being president means that you are not just dictating the lives of Americans, but you are making decisions that affect everyone in the world. Now, it is easier to make decisions and have a positive impact at home and how your voters view you on foreign policy than domestic policy. Even if you lose at foreign policy, if you're good enough at manipulating the information and the story, it comes out as a victory. So it makes a lot of sense that Joe Biden has been investing a lot of his efforts in foreign policy. One is to gain popular support, which there's nothing wrong with that. Again, as I stated, I'm not criticizing anyone today on this podcast. I'm just stating some realities that they're facing at home, which they are compensating with problems abroad. Now, Joe Biden is doing this to consolidate popular support at home. Two, Joe Biden is also doing this because his predecessor, Donald J. Trump, seemed to be relatively absent, at least regarding America's Western allies, those in Europe, on the international sphere. Joe Biden has a lot of work to do to rebuild these relationships, especially as they regard the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is ideologically something that's very important to Joe Biden, not being an isolationist and believing that America has to have a major globalist presence. This is actually a fundamental aspect of what was Joe Biden's campaign when he was running to become president. Now, finally, when it comes to international policy or foreign affairs as the President of the United States, you're not carrying out these actions alone. Many of the public statements that are made, many of the speeches that are given, etc., are made by the Secretary of State. So for someone that is in an advanced age, that is very visible, working in foreign policy, which is easy to win domestic points in, is actually very favorable because you don't have to personally go out there all the time and talk about it. You can just send Anthony Blinken, who is a wonderful speaker and just an exceptional Secretary of State, to do it for you. Now we're going to move on to Emmanuel Macron, who actually, out of all of these world leaders, is probably the most secure in his power. But nonetheless, Macron has faced a lot of criticisms, primarily when Macron became president of France. Many people viewed him as this outsider that was coming in to change the fundamental functions of the republic. But the reality is that Macron has been more of an elitist and more of an insider than probably the previous French presidents that came before him. Now, Macron additionally was viewed as someone who had ambiguous stances towards the European Union when running for president of France. Many people viewed that he would take a more assertive approach. He was never at any moment anti-EU, but that Macron would look out more for the interests of France. Now, fundamentally, this has changed, especially after the retirement of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who was the de facto leader of the EU. Now, a lot of people in other EU countries who aren't Germany, especially smaller Slavic ones that are relevant, are going to say, no, we're all equal in the European Union. Our commissioner runs the EU. That's not true. The de facto leader of the European Union was German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel is now retired. And Emmanuel Macron, as the leader of an equally powerful, equally economically relevant country, has kind of de facto taken this form of leadership. Now, this is actually not a bad thing for Macron. It has caused a lot of criticism for people that thought that he was going to be an outsider and work against the political mainstream of France. But it has given Macron a lot of opportunity to not focus on domestic issues and gain support on international ones, especially ones that resonate very strongly with the French people. Taking a strong stance against Russia is popular with the French. France, being a dominant political force in the world arena, resonates with French people, and this does help make Macron more popular. Now, in terms of specific domestic issues, Macron is facing a lot of them, but none of them are exactly extremely major. One that can be mentioned, though, is that the trucker protests, or the convoy of freedom that emerged in Canada, has caused a global movement. And there have been many plans to create copycat movements in other countries and other supranations. Now, the trucker movement is probably going to occur in the United States. And I just want to give a brief coverage of what the Freedom Convoy is. Basically, it's a bunch of truckers who got upset at vaccination requirements to cross the US-Canada border to move their goods. The truckers didn't want to get vaccinated, and they didn't agree with a lot of coronavirus restrictions. And this turned into a massive convoy and protest that has been completely obstructive to trade and everything else. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Being obstructive is a good way to protest, but it has caused a lot of trade issues. Now, copycat movements have threatened to arise in the United States, specifically this upcoming weekend around the Super Bowl, which could cause major traffic and infrastructural blockages. Now, in France, many truckers have been talking about converging on Paris, right? Just blocking all the roads in Paris. This could be another potential issue for Macron, and it's good to have this chaos in Europe and focusing on it, as Macron has developed an image as being one of the people that's going to push for peace and avoid the Russo-Ukrainian crisis ending in war. So this is obviously beneficial for Macron as well. Now, the final person that I want to focus on is German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with Olaf Scholz, except for the fact that he's German. But the one major problem that Olaf Scholz is facing is that he's not Angela Merkel. Now, we've covered before how Angela Merkel went into retirement, and like her or hate her, Angela Merkel is considered one of the world's most prevalent and predominant world leaders in contemporary history, okay? And anyone that followed her stride would have a lot of difficulty filling the shoes, so to say. Now, Olaf Scholz is someone that is not completely unknown to the German people. Olaf Scholz was Angela Merkel's Minister of Finance, despite being a member of the Social Democratic Party. Now, that was part of a larger coalition that the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, made with the Social Democratic Party, and Olaf Scholz became the finance minister because of that. But Olaf Scholz is now the Chancellor of Germany, and that is a lot more power than just being some Minister of Finance. In addition to this, he's following probably what is considered one of the best chancellors and leaders in German history. It's hard to follow up this act. Olaf Scholz has only been chancellor for 2 months, and he is using this crisis to begin establishing his name. Now, there is one key problem with Olaf Scholz that is of completely no fault to his own. As the former Minister of Finance, Scholz has absolutely zero foreign policy experience. And this is something that is pretty much at the highest level of foreign policy. This is brinkmanship. This is hardcore diplomacy. This is preventing a potential conflict from escalating into a war. Now, this could make or break Olaf Scholz, and his administration and the way that he's been treating this crisis has actually, because of his lack of experience, probably hurt his image more than helped it. Germany, at the beginning of the crisis, famously offered to send, and they did send, 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. Now, to Germany's credit, Ukraine had actually asked for these helmets, but that's all they sent. And the mayor of Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine, said, "What is next? Pillows?" It looked funny. While other countries were sending soldiers to various other Eastern European countries bordering Ukraine that are NATO allies, such as Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania, and sending weapons such as anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, and sending aircraft carriers and aircraft or naval ships closer to Ukraine, Germany was sending helmets. It looked absurd. Now, finally, Olaf Scholz has taken a stronger economic stance against what could be potential sanctions against Russia. Now, Olaf Scholz is doing this because this is his first true test of if he is able to or not able to fill in the shoes of Angela Merkel. Now, one final comment about Merkel's chancellorship of Germany. Her chancellorship was defined by crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. Angela Merkel was not an exceptionally good leader for Germany domestically speaking. Her chancellorship was defined by foreign policy issues, which she actually managed to meet and address relatively in a well way. Now, some of these obviously have been controversial, such as accepting millions of migrants into Germany from Syria and other Arabic countries and African countries, which have affected the demographic makeup of Germany. But nonetheless, Angela Merkel relatively survived all of these crises and brought Europe and the Western world together in times where everything seemed completely catastrophic. She also faced an economic crisis, the first Russo-Ukrainian crisis that occurred in Crimea and the Russian support of separatists in the eastern Donbass region. Merkel was extremely active on the foreign policy scale. And Scholz, if he wants to recreate her success or popularity, is going to have to replicate that. Now, this first test for Scholz has been hit and miss, notably giving a very lackluster response in the beginning towards tensions rising in Ukraine, to his meeting to America almost kind of ending in Germany being submissive to the United States. But he does have a chance to get back his image because he will be visiting Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on two separate meetings occurring on February 14th and February 15th, respectively. So, just to kind of conclude our report, world leaders like Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, and Emmanuel Macron are using the Russo-Ukrainian crisis as an opportunity to consolidate popular domestic support in their countries and distract their people from other problems that are going on. Now, this is not their only motivation, but it is a large part of what is driving this decision-making. And finally, Olaf Scholz is just using this entire situation to say, "Hi guys, I'm your new chancellor, this me, yeah?" To show people that he is actually the chancellor of Germany and that he can effectively do the job just as much, if not better, than Angela Merkel. Will he be able to demonstrate this? Only time will tell, and we shall see. Let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments. Let's have a nice open discussion about what's going on in the Russo-Ukrainian crisis, and if you're from any of these countries, what you think about these world leaders and the domestic problems that you're facing on a day-to-day basis. Like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'll see you next time.